The storm had passed, but the sky still burned with a strange copper light as Elias pulled himself from the wreckage of the frontier dawn. The air was dry and bitter, stinging his throat with every breath. Shards of twisted metal and shattered glass lay scattered across the sand, the remains of the ship that had carried him across the stars. He had survived, but survival here did not mean safety. His supplies were almost gone, and his locator beacon had been damaged in the crash. Somewhere out there, weeks or months away, help might be searching, but for now, the horizon offered nothing but jagged black rocks and endless emptiness. He stumbled through the wasteland, the soles of his boots crunching on brittle sand. Hunger gnawed at him, but he knew every bite counted. He still had a few ration packs tucked in his pack, carefully sealed, their weight feeling far heavier than they should have. His mind kept whispering that without them he would not last more than a few days. Yet as he moved through the strange landscape, he could not shake the feeling that he was not alone. Shadows shifted on the edge of his vision, vanishing whenever he turned his head. The air carried faint sounds, almost like voices, but thin and trembling, as if the wind itself were crying. It was when he reached the base of a towering ridge that he saw them. Figures, tall and impossibly thin, stood among the rocks, their skin pale like moonlight, their eyes deep and glistening in the fading light. They made no move toward him, but he could feel the weight of their gaze. There was something haunting in the way they stood, as if too weak to take a step forward, yet unwilling to look away. Their faces were long and drawn, and their bodies looked as though they had been starved for years. Elias knelt and pulled a ration pack from his bag. It was a small thing, a square of dried fruit and protein paste, barely enough for one meal. He tore open the seal, and the smell drifted into the air. That was when he noticed the sound. It was not the wind. It was them. Low, broken sobs, the kind that came from someone who had no strength left to hide their pain. Their eyes were fixed on the food in his hands. No one spoke, yet their faces told him everything. The hunger, the suffering, the desperate hope. That he might give them even a crumb. For a long moment, he hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep the food, to think of his own survival. But their trembling hands and hollow eyes broke something in him. Slowly, he stepped forward, holding out a small piece to the one who stood closest. The figure stared at it, then at him, before reaching out with shaking fingers. The moment it touched its lips, its eyes closed and tears spilled down its cheeks. It sank to its knees, clutching the food as if it were the most precious thing in the universe. The others began to move now, not rushing, but shuffling forward as if afraid he might vanish before they reached him. Elias shared what little he could, watching as each bite brought both relief and grief. They ate in silence, but the air was thick with emotion, as if this simple act had broken through a wall between them. When the last piece was gone, the tallest of them stepped forward. Its voice was soft and strange, filled with sounds Elias did not understand. Yet the meaning was clear. Gratitude, and something more, a warning perhaps. The figure pointed toward the sky, where faint lights flickered against the copper clouds. The other beings reacted instantly, turning toward the rocks and gesturing for Elias to follow. Their movements carried urgency now, their earlier weakness replaced by fear. Elias hesitated, glancing back at the open wasteland. The lights were growing brighter, moving slowly but steadily toward them. Whatever they were, the beings did not want to be seen. With no better choice, he followed them toward a narrow cleft in the ridge. As they slipped inside, the world outside seemed to vanish, replaced by the cool darkness of a winding tunnel. The sound of the wind faded, but the air inside was heavy with another smell, the smell of too many people surviving in too small a space, and the faint, unshakable scent of hunger that had never truly left. He did not yet know who they were, or why they had been crying, But one thing was certain. This was not just a meeting by chance. Something had brought them together, and whatever was coming from the sky was a danger they all shared. The tunnel twisted deep into the ridge, until the copper light from outside faded to nothing but a faint glow far behind them. Elias followed. The strange beings through the darkness, his footsteps echoing against the stone. The air grew cooler and heavier the deeper they went, and soon he began to hear the soft shuffle of many feet ahead. The narrow passage opened into a vast chamber lit by a dim, ghostly blue light that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. It was here that Elias truly understood the scale of their suffering. All around him were more of the tall, fragile beings, some lying weakly on the ground, others sitting against the stone with their arms wrapped around their thin bodies, as if to hold themselves together. The faint light revealed their hollow cheeks, their eyes too large for their gaunt faces, their skin stretched tight over delicate bones. As Elias stepped into the chamber, dozens of eyes turned toward him. There was no anger in their gaze, only a deep, aching hunger and something else too. A spark of hope so fragile that it seemed ready to vanish if he made one wrong move. A small figure, no taller than his waist, stumbled forward. Its head tilted as it studied him, then it reached out with a trembling hand toward the pouch at his side. Elias gently pushed it away, not in rejection, but because he knew he had nothing left to give. The childlike being's shoulders slumped, and it returned to a shadowed corner where two others sat close, their eyes still fixed on him. The tall one who had led him here, the one he had begun to think of as their guide, stepped to his side. In the soft, musical language Elias could not understand, it began to speak. The words were strange, but the rhythm and tone carried meaning. The guide pointed upward toward the cave roof, then toward the distant sky beyond the ridge. It neighed, a motion like something falling, then spread its long fingers wide to show destruction. Elias caught pieces of meaning in these gestures. Something had come from above, something that had taken away their food, something that had left the land broken. As the guide spoke, Elias glanced around and saw strange carvings etched into the walls, faint but still clear in the blue light. The carving showed tall towers of green plants and wide rivers filled with fish, and then sharp shapes descending from the sky. The next carvings were filled with jagged lines and dark clouds. The plants gone, the rivers empty. Elias felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. This place had once been alive, full of food and water and life. Now it was only dust and hunger. Suddenly, the soft murmur in the chamber broke. A sharp, panicked cry rang out from near the entrance of the tunnel. Two beings appeared, their long arms waving urgently. The guide's head snapped toward them, and without hesitation, it moved quickly to Elias, gesturing for him to follow deeper into the cavern. Elias could see the fear in their movements, and he remembered the lights in the sky. Whatever was coming, it was not just a threat. It was something that made even these desperate beings flee without hesitation. They moved through a series of smaller tunnels that wound in tight curves. The walls seemed to press closer as they went, and the air grew warmer. The sound of distant clicking and humming reached Elias's ears, strange mechanical noises that echoed faintly through the stone. The guide glanced at him, then made a sharp gesture for silence. Elias obeyed, holding his breath as they passed through a narrow gap into another chamber. This one was smaller, almost hidden, and filled with the faint rustle of movement. In the shadows Elias saw more figures. These were even thinner, many lying on the ground too weak to stand. He saw a being lifting a cup of pale liquid to another's mouth, the motion slow and careful, as if the smallest spill would be a terrible loss. It was then that Elias realized the truth. These people were not just hungry, they were dying. Whatever food they found was barely enough to keep them alive another day. He thought of the rations he had left behind in the wreck, buried in the sand near the ridge. They were few, but here even a single packet would mean life for many. His instincts told him to keep them for himself, to save his own strength. Yet the memory of the beings weeping over that first bite gnawed at him. The guide knelt before him, speaking softly, pointing toward the sound of the clicking and humming. Elias understood without words. The threat was near. The lights he had seen in the sky belonged to the machines that had ruined this world, and now they were searching again. Whether they hunted for food, for life, or for him, he did not yet know. But in the eyes of the guide and the others, he saw the same truth. If the machines found this place, the last of these people would be gone. Elias felt his heartbeat quicken as the sound grew louder. Somewhere in the tunnels behind them, the machines were moving closer. The guide touched his arm, a gesture not of fear but of trust. Whatever happened next, they were asking him to stand with them. The sound in the tunnels grew sharper with each passing moment, and Elias could almost feel it in his bones, like the steady beat of a strange mechanical heart moving closer through the stone walls. The guide led him deeper into the cave until they reached another chamber, larger than the rest. This one was different. In the center lay a low platform, made from smooth black rock, and on its surface were laid out objects that looked far older than the machines, or even the carvings on the walls. Long strips of cloth, painted with fading colors, hung from the ceiling, showing tall green plants, wide fields of gold, and skies filled with bright silver birds that were not machines but living creatures. The images told a story without words, one of a world once full of life and food in such abundance that no one knew hunger. Elias walked slowly past them, his eyes tracing the changes from bright scenes of life to darker ones, where jagged metal shapes fell from the heavens, and the skies turned thick and gray. The guide joined him at the platform, touching one of the painted cloths with careful hands, as if it might crumble at the lightest touch. It began to speak, the strange musical language flowing like water. Elias did not understand the words, yet the tone carried sorrow and anger. The guide pointed to the images of the falling metal shapes, and then to the machines drawn as endless swarms covering the land. Through gestures it showed how the machines ate the plants and poisoned the rivers, how they broke the soil until nothing could grow, and how they did not leave until there was nothing left to take. When Elias glanced toward the others in the chamber, he saw them watching in silence, their eyes holding the weight of generations who had seen their home die. He began to piece it together in his mind. A mining fleet from some distant world must have come here, seeing the planet not as a home, but as a resource to be stripped. The machines they used did their work with perfect efficiency, leaving no trace of what they destroyed. When the land could no longer feed them, they left, abandoning the people to a slow, cruel death. That explained the endless hunger, the hollow eyes, and the way even the children moved with the tired steps of the starving. The clicking in the distance was no longer faint. It was moving through the outer tunnels now, deliberate and steady. The guide's hands moved quickly as it gestured to Elias, pointing toward him and then toward the sound. Elias frowned, confused, until the guide pointed to the small pouch at his side, and then to the entrance of the chamber. The machines were searching for something organic, something alive, and the scent of his food might have drawn them here. He realized with a cold weight in his chest that he might have led them straight to these people. The guide moved to the back of the chamber, motioning for Elias to follow. They entered another passage, this one sloping upward and filled with loose stones that shifted underfoot. At the top they reached a narrow gap that opened into a high ledge. From here Elias could see out across the wasteland. The sky was darker now, streaked with deep red as the sun sank low. Far in the distance, small shapes moved across the sand, in precise formation. Even from here he could see the dull gleam of metal in their bodies. They moved like predators, slow but certain, and as the last light of day touched them, their surfaces caught the glow and reflected it like blood. The guide's voice was low but urgent. It pointed to the far horizon and then to the wreckage of Elias's ship half buried in the sand. He understood the meaning at once. If the machines were following the scent of the food, it might be possible to lead them away from the caves toward the wreck. Perhaps the machines would focus on the larger source and leave the caves untouched. It was a dangerous idea, and one that would almost certainly put him in their path, but he could not ignore the truth in the guide's eyes. If he did nothing, the machines would find the caves, and there would be no one left to save. He stood on the ledge, feeling the dry wind whip at his face. Somewhere deep inside he still hoped for rescue, still imagined the signal beacon reaching some passing ship. But now that hope seemed small and far away compared to the need before him. These people had nothing. They had been given nothing. The first thing they had received in a long time was the food he had shared, and they had wept for it. If he turned away now, that hope would die with them. The guide placed a long, thin hand on his shoulder, a silent promise that he would not face this alone. Elias looked once more at the dark shapes in the distance, and then down at the caves where the weak and starving waited in silence. He knew his choice was made before he even took the first step from the ledge. The wind outside the ledge had grown sharper, carrying with it the bitter taste of the desert and the faint metallic scent of the machines. Elias followed the guide. Down from the ridge, their steps quick but careful so as not to loosen the stones and send noise echoing into the still air. The shapes in the distance had drawn closer, and now he could see more detail in their forms. Sleek bodies of silver and black, long jointed legs that moved without sound, heads that turned with a slow, searching motion. They were hunting. Not with sight alone, but with sensors that tasted the air for traces of life. They kept low, moving along the shadowed side of the ridge until the caves were hidden from sight. The guide moved ahead with a quiet urgency, glancing back often to make sure Elias stayed close. The wreck of the Frontier Dawn lay far across the wasteland, its broken hull tilted like the bones of some ancient creature. It seemed impossibly far with the machines already closing in, but it was their only chance to pull them away from the caves. Elias knew that every step would take him further from safety, but the thought of the hollow faces in the chamber kept him moving. The first part of the journey was silent, except for the steady thud of their feet in the sand. Every few moments the guide would stop, crouch low, and listen. The clicking of the machines came and went on the wind, sometimes faint, sometimes so near that Elias's skin prickled. Once they dropped flat behind a rise of stone as a small scout unit passed by no more than 20 paces away. Elias held his breath, watching the thin legs step over the sand without leaving a mark. The machine's head turned once toward them, and for a long moment, it seemed to sniff the air before moving on. They pushed on until the wreck began to rise larger on the horizon. Its sharp edges caught the fading light, and Elias felt a twist in his chest at the sight of it. That broken ship had been his last link to the world beyond this one, and now it was only a tool in a desperate gamble. The guide slowed as they neared the wreck, scanning the open ground. They had to move fast. If the machines caught sight of them before they reached it, there would be no chance to set the plan in motion. Inside the shattered hull, the air was still and dry. The guide waited at the entrance while Elias dug through the debris, pulling out the last of his rations and the small emergency beacon. The beacon was old, but still functional, its signal strong enough to draw the machines from miles away. He set it on a half-buried panel and activated it, the light pulsing in a slow rhythm. Almost at once the clicking grew sharper in the distance. No longer scattered but moving in unison toward the wreck, the guide touched his arm and gestured toward a narrow gully running away from the ship. They would hide there until the machines were drawn in, then slip back toward the caves. Elias nodded, but his gaze lingered on the wreck. If the machines reached it, they might discover its power cells and scavenge them for parts. That could give them more strength to hunt again. A thought began to form in his mind, dangerous but clear. If the ship could be destroyed completely, the explosion might wipe out a large part of the swarm. He moved quickly to the engineering section, where damaged fuel cells still lay beneath a tangle of metal. Working by feel, he set the cells to overload. It would not be a massive blast, but in the narrow basin where the wreck rested, the force would be enough to tear through the approaching machines. The guide watched in silence, understanding without words that Elias was choosing path with no return. The clicking was loud now, surrounding them from three sides. Elias and the guide slipped into the gully, crouching low as the first of the machines crested the rise and poured toward the wreck. There were more than he had expected, a swarm of shining bodies moving with perfect coordination. They reached the ship and began tearing into its hull, the sound of metal screaming against metal filling the air. Elias pressed the detonator, and the world became fire and sand. The blast tore through the wreck, hurling shards of metal high into the air. The machines at the front vanished in the light, their bodies shattered. Those behind fell in a tangled heap, legs flailing before going still. The shockwave rolled across the basin and up the gully, knocking Elias and the guide to the ground. When the sound faded, only the wind remained. The wreck was gone, reduced to twisted fragments scattered across the desert. The swarm lay broken, pieces of their sleek forms half buried in the sand. Elias knew the cost of what he had done. The last hope of leaving this world had vanished with the blast. But the caves were safe, and for now, so were the people within them. The guide rose slowly and looked at him with an expression that needed no translation. It was not pity or sorrow, but a quiet respect, the kind given to one who has given more than he was ever asked to give. The days after the explosion passed, slowly beneath a quieter sky. The copper light still hung over the land, and the wind still whispered across the ridges, but the clicking of the machines was gone. The desert felt empty in a different way now, not as a hunter's ground, but as a space where something might grow again if given the chance. Elias and the guide returned to the caves under that strange light, their steps heavy with exhaustion but also with a kind of relief. When they entered the main chamber, the people rose to greet them in silence. There were no shouts or sudden movements, only the still gaze of those who understood the weight of what had been risked and the cost that had been paid. The guide spoke softly to them, its hands moving in slow, graceful shapes that Elias could almost read. They learned of the wreck's destruction and the machines scattered in the sand, and their eyes turned to Elias with an expression he had not seen before. It was not just gratitude, but a kind of acceptance, as though in that moment he was no longer an outsider, who had stumbled into their suffering, but someone who belonged within their circle. With the danger gone, Elias began to turn his thoughts toward the small collection of seeds he had carried in a sealed pouch from the wreck. They were meant for survival rations, samples of hardy plants that could grow in poor soil, intended for colonists who might find themselves on barren worlds. He had kept them as a last resort for himself, but now he saw their true worth. With the help of the guide and a few others who still had strength, he found a small pocket of soil near the caves that had escaped the worst of the poison. It was a shallow valley sheltered from the wind and touched by a thin stream of water that seeped from the rocks. They worked slowly, clearing stones and breaking the hard ground with tools fashioned from broken scraps of the ship. The first seeds were placed carefully into the earth, and every morning the people came to see if they had changed. Weeks passed before the first fragile green shoots appeared, pushing up from the soil like shy messengers from another time. The day Elias saw the first one, he felt something deep in his chest loosen, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The shoots grew, slowly at first, then with more strength, as the weeks turned into months. The people began to share their strength with the plants, carrying water from the stream and shielding them from the harshest sun with woven mats. Air in the valley began to smell different, carrying a hint of life that had not been present for many years. For Elias, the work became more than survival. It was a way of anchoring himself to this place, of turning the choice he had made into something lasting. When the first harvest came, the entire community gathered in the valley. The plants were not many, but their leaves were thick and their roots heavy with food. The guide placed the first harvest in a wide, shallow bowl and carried it to Elias. The people stood in a circle, their eyes bright in the fading light, and the guide offered him the first bite. Elias hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. He had come here by accident, a stranger with little to give, and yet this act had changed them all. He took the bite, and as the taste filled his mouth he heard a sound rise from the circle, not weeping this time but a soft, steady hum like a song shared between many voices. That night the caves were filled with the warmth of full bellies and quiet laughter. The children moved with more energy, the elders sat straighter, and the air no longer carried only the scent of dust. Elias sat among them, listening to the low music of their language, understanding now that words were only part of what they shared. He thought of the stars above and the worlds he would never see, but the thought no longer carried the ache it once did. Here, in this place where hunger had ruled for so long, life had begun to return. As the firelight flickered against the walls, Elias looked at the faces around him and knew he was no longer waiting for rescue. He had already found his place. The machines had taken much from this world, but they had not taken the will of its people to survive, and they had not taken from him the choice to stand beside them. In the silence between the flames and the soft song, he felt the truth settle in his heart. Humanity's strength was not only in the ships it built or the machines it commanded, but in the hands that offered food to the hungry, even when those hands had little to give. The end.